Hey everybody. Alrighty, how is everyone doing out there? Hope you're all doing well. And we are here today again to talk about composition. Now this is the fifth in a series of episodes from this masterclass where we talk specifically about composition and making your compositions work better in your illustrations. So I'm hoping that we can get down into some nitty-gritty stuff here today with a little bit more of a detailed look at specifically silhouette. Okay, first of all, I want to talk about silhouette, what that means, and how you can improve that in your illustrations and in your compositions. And I also want to talk about overlap, okay, things that are overlapping. All right, so it looks like we had a brief technical glitch there for a moment where the streams got overlapped somehow, but I think I'm live now. I'm seeing both people say hello in the chat, so it looks like we're in good shape. Nice to see you all. Alrighty. If you're watching on YouTube, I want to remind you, please bounce over to behance.net/live. That's where you can join me in the chat. You can ask questions and make comments as we go, as well as have a nice conversation with all the other folks who are watching, and you can follow along there. On YouTube, I am really unable to sort of keep up with the chat there, so it's best for me to have you all here on Behance so I can watch there. Alrighty, well let's talk about this composition from last time. Now this is where we left off when we were talking about composition 2 weeks ago. We had a 1 week break there where I did a special masterclass on digital inking, which you can find archived on YouTube. And that was for Lightbox Expo. I hope some of you had a chance to go and enjoy that fantastic conference. It was just fantastic as usual. And my hat's off to Bobby Chu and to everybody who helped to organize and make that such a successful event. Bravo. Okie dokie. Now, what I want to do here, like I said, is start talking first about silhouette. Now, this illustration is taking good advantage of clear silhouette design, in that if I were to reduce this in size and just show you a little postage stamp image like that, you'd be able to quickly read what is happening in the drawing. For example, I'll just make a new layer here and I'll circle this. This figure here, okay, of Gretel, this is a Hansel and Gretel illustration we were working on. This figure reads as a human figure. And part of the reason this is reading clearly as a human figure is because I chose to turn the head to profile. And even though this is rough and we haven't even gotten down into really doing any details yet, we still understand that this is a profile of a human head. I also wanted to put the hair up to create another shape at the back of the head there for two reasons. One, to quickly indicate that this was a female character, as well as this dress that we have for the silhouette here. The other reason this reads clearly is because I've separated the arms from the torso. So by doing this in the silhouette, I'm instantly able to recognize that this is a human figure. If I had had the arms in, touching the body, right, or overlapping the body in some way, that shape, if it were just a black and white shape, would be more difficult to figure out or read as being a human being. So that separation there, having the arms separate from the torso, helps with that as well. Same goes here for getting the legs to read, right, 1 and 2. All right, so that separation there helps us to see that as, again, a human. And the same goes for our friend Hansel over here. Now, if I had had him posed in such a way where he were leaned over farther and maybe his shoulders came up above the head to a point where maybe he were looking down or something like that, it would be more difficult to understand what I was looking at. But because that head is clearly distinct, from the shoulders there. We have, again, this shape here of the arm separated from the torso, right, which has that nice curve of the back there. We understand this pose of him leaning forward, but not so much so that I lose that silhouette. And again, we have the separation of the legs. And so there's nothing about these poses that makes it hard, even at a very small size, to read them as human figures. So that's one area where we're taking advantage of the silhouette there. Now, just as a demonstration or example, I'd like to show you what happens when your silhouette isn't as clear. So if I were to have a figure, zoom in a little bit. All right, let's say we have a figure who's doing this. We have them sitting down, and maybe they've got their arms wrapped around the legs, right, the knees. So here's a figure sitting down in this kind of a pose, all right? Now, because I'm using line to draw this, we can all understand what's happening, right? We can say, all right, yes, I understand what I'm looking at. Here's a person seated, and yeah, that's very clear. Now, hang on a second. Watch what happens when I do this. All right, as a shape, that no longer reads clearly as a human, at least not as quickly as we'd like. And so when you lose that element of line, and all you are dealing with is shape or silhouette, which is what we're talking about here, right? This outer shape, that clarity is missing. We had it with the line, okay? So we'll go back and look. We're okay there. If line is our language and we draw a figure this way, it's okay. We can get away with it, right? But if we're going for a solid shape and we're looking at darks and lights, we wind up in trouble here. That is why, and this notan here was from the last class. If you missed that, you can go back and watch it. That was the fourth in this series. We talked about darks and lights and notan sketches to help you to figure out your composition, which is a great exercise. Let's go back to where we were. Here we go. All right. So, but then with this now, that's why I've separated the arms, as I said, from the torso. You got the legs separated. Everything about these figures is meant to read clearly at a glance without me having to rely on more subtle values or line, etc., to define what's going on. Now, the same can be said for the other shapes that we're using to sort of frame the house here. And I talked in, I think, the first or second in the series about framing. You have informal frames and formal frames. This is an informal framing device where I'm using organic materials of some kind within the illustration to essentially, and also values. So darks here on the outside, these dark areas are framing this area of the illustration. That's where our house is. I'm trying to get this area here like a vignette. We're looking inwards towards here. And what's framing this lighter area is these darker shapes around it. Now, those each have important silhouettes as well. In order for me to understand that this big chunky shape here, okay, if I were to just outline it for a moment, in order to understand what that is, it's important for me to use this smaller branch with clear smaller branch shapes, okay, and foliage to tell me that this is a large tree. Okay, now, if we only had the trunk without this area here, this other object that we're attaching to that tree shape, we would have a more difficult time communicating what that is to the viewer. Okay, there are other things too we're looking at here, such as texture, the suggestion of these, just here and there, these slightly lighter areas, right? Here, here, and the way this is broken up on the edge here. I'm trying to create, see this, the way the roots are broken up at the bottom. these shapes are helping again to define for me in a simple way, as simple as possible. I'm trying to strip things down to a simple statement of some kind for that, what that object is, as complex as it might be. That is then helping this to all read clearly. Another reason then for adding these two shapes right here, just to the left of this other tree trunk. Okay, that just helps because we're getting that repetition. We're seeing, okay, I understand what this is, right? Because it leads to this, all right? But by repeating that motif right here, right, there, by echoing it, it's enough for the viewer to make that connection and say, ah, those must be more tree branches. Okay, I see now this is a cluster of trees, right? Then we have the mirroring of this action over here. That mirroring then back and forth, okay, tells me exactly what's going on, and I can clearly pick that out. Then again, we are repeating once again that sort of kind of shape language here on this smaller branch that is growing up off from the ground here, or maybe it's a root that's been popped up out of the ground. Whatever it happens to be, that shape language is the same, and because we're repeating it, the viewer has no trouble understanding what that is. They're not going to look at that and say, well, that must be a garden hose. No, they understand that this is a part of a tree, some kind of a natural growth from the earth there, as with these other elements. Okay, so that's the idea there. So this is what we're talking about when we say we're talking about silhouette in your design and having that read clearly. These things, in my opinion, they really have to work when you scale things down to the simplest possible statements in your early drawing, your early sketch, when you're looking at the general value, arrangement of values in your work, because everything else will essentially fall into place if you get these things worked out up front. One of the keys is to take the time early on in your illustration. This is why, by the way, I love thumbnails. When you're doing thumbnail illustrations, little sketches to figure out what your composition will be, you have the opportunity to arrange the elements of your composition in lots of different ways to find the most pleasing arrangement. And the pressure is off to spend too much time on getting into details, right? You're just looking at the bigger shapes and the medium-sized shapes for the most part and trying to place them in such a way that things will read clearly, that there is balance in the illustration, and that the eye will be led to the focal points that are important for understanding what the illustration is about, right? All right, so as an exercise for yourself, I think for silhouettes, it's important to just think about objects and think about the easiest way for you to recognize what that object is if you were not given the opportunity to see any details other than the silhouette, the outline of that object. This is a really good thing you can try with animals too. For the most part, you know, we can look at profiles, side views, and that's a way to see things clearly. You know, if a cat, for example, I'm just going to do a really cartoony one because I'm not great with cat anatomy here, so just forgive me. But let's say there's a cat facing sort of towards me here, right? And it's crouched down, ready to pounce on something or whatever. So its body is going to be all kind of crouched like this. Okay, well, because again, I'm using line, right? I'm not in too much trouble here. I could show this to somebody and they say, oh yeah, it's a cat and they're crouched down. Okay, I get that. All right, so there's that kitty cat crouched down. We get that. Again, what happens when I outline this? Okay, and do that. What are we left with? Well, that could be probably a booger from your nose. Sorry to be gross, but Honestly, it could be anything. That is just not not a great shape, is it? Not a great silhouette. How do you fix that? So let's look at it again. Slide that over here. All right. Now we could do that same pose and just do a slight turn here. Okay, so a little bit more of a 3/4 view kind of thing here. I'm kind of taking it into too much a profile world here, so let me just fix that a little bit. All right, so we're doing this now. All right, and we can have that one ear pop just up over the body and have them crouch like this. Again, like I said, I am not a cat anatomy expert, so look at Steinlen if you want to see amazing cat drawings, James Steinlen. But now let's do this. Let's improve things by putting that tail out there. All right, so now we're getting a lot closer to a silhouette that reads clearly. Okay. All right, so if I show that to somebody, tidy up those edges a little bit, just kind of clean that up, and say now, okay, what do you think that is? And try and make that as crisp as possible there. You know, now they might say, oh yeah, it's a mouse or whatever. Again, I'm not the best at drawing cats here. But what we can see from this is, now see I'm refining, trying to work this out to make it a little clearer, make that ear a little more prominent. Right? This is starting to get into that territory where I could show this to somebody and they could say, hey, I think I understand what I'm looking at. Okay? So then, of course, even better would be something like from, maybe it's a cat leaping or let's say yeah, it's gonna be like leaping through the air or something, whatever. See that now? So I separate those limbs. And hopefully that will read more clearly to whoever sees that. And now if we isolate just the outline here, we should be getting into much better territory for making this a more legible kind of situation. All right, so you see the difference. So this is an exercise you can do, is to find silhouettes that you can draw that are legible and that will help people to understand what it is that you're looking at. And then think about that when you're making your next semi-complex composition so that things can read clearly. And think about how these things apply to the foreground, the middle ground, and the background in your drawing, right? So let's jump back here for a second, because this brings me to the relationship here between the first thing I want to talk about, which is silhouettes, but then the second idea, which is overlapping. So I need to have a way of, the way I think about things is, part of me is, imagine that you have different layers of glass and you have illustrations or sections of your illustration on each of those layers of glass, or planes, you could think of them like that. And you want each of them to be separated from one another and read clearly as a sort of a foreground, middle background, background. So you're building these layers into the illustration. And each of those layers, because of the overlap, needs to be read clearly. And the shapes in those layers, if you want them to read clearly, you have to be considering silhouettes. So these things do go hand in hand in some instances. And that's why when I was designing this house, which still is not finished. I mean, there's obviously a lot to do here to get this to really shape up. But this idea, here, if I just isolate this shape and then come on back, that is by itself, you know, as a chimney shape, a roof shape, right? We can understand what we're looking at. Also, that's why we throw in that dark right here. This is why we have this dark right here. We break up this big front-facing plane of the house with the dark for the door. That dark rectangle helps then to, where was I here? There? Darn it, I gotta remember all my layers, gang. Here we go. Hide this for a second. If you come right here, this dark shape breaks apart nicely this front plane here, right? Okie dokie. And clearly makes me understand, oh, okay, I'm looking at some kind of a house or a cottage or whatever. But again, this could use some more work. And this is something where I would probably want to come in and start thinking about, like, does this roof shape get interrupted by this sort of awning or this area that juts out for the front door? You know, would I want to interrupt that? Would I want to have it go more like this, break out and down and then back to that roof shape? Or do I want to keep it clean, one straight shot? What about the way that we are relating the house to the branch here? Is that getting too close to a tangent? A tangent would be this. It would be if this happened, where the point of the corner of that roof, right, as it heads towards the apex there of that triangle, would make contact with the diagonal of the underside of this branch. That would be very dangerous because it would flatten that area of the illustration and we'd lose that feeling of overlapping. So to correct that, what I would do is I could change the angle here. I could change the tilt of the roof. That might be one thing I would do, either this way or that way, or I could then add a little top like that and change the whole shape of the roof this way. Still keep that chimney more or less where it is. That might be one option. All right. Another thing I could do is bring it down and bring it over, okay, and then have some lighter area up there. Lots of design choices to make that can solve that problem, but I do want to avoid any tangents, especially when I'm overlapping a foreground object with an object that's much farther away. And of course, scale helps with this because this house, we know it to be a house, we know it to be a building where people can stand up inside, at least we hope that's what's going to happen. Because of the scale of this, and because the values are a little lighter than what we have over here, right? So atmospheric perspective, we're pushing values lighter as we go farther and farther into the distance, right? Those things combined with one another and the silhouette that's recognizable as a house should help us to understand that we are much closer to the viewer here. These figures are closer to us than this house is. This is not a miniature house, okay? So these are other things you have to think about. Scale. All right, let me check the chat here and see. We've got a lot of people here. I want to see if we have any questions before I go any farther because I have been doing quite a bit of talking. All right, let's see. Viola has been drawing cats. Oh, good. Viola, I wish you could have drawn better cats than I did here just a moment ago. Let's see. I'm just reading here really quickly. Hello, hello. Hi, nice to see everybody. I see a lot of hellos. That's very cool. Thanks. Nice to see you all. Thanks for being here. Oh, that's very kind. Thank you, Stacy. Yes, the brush I used for this was the cool drag brush in the Mega Pack painting box, in case anybody's curious, to make this value study. And that was in the last episode. Yes, there are, Stacy, that's right. So the skulls we put in there as another mini focal point, something that's kind of like a bonus for the viewer. Once they get past understanding the main two focal points for the illustration here, we go over here and say, oh look, a little more of a storytelling element there that helps us with this. So that helps. Any tips on getting the perspective right throughout the illustration? It troubles me when I add more elements. Well, that's a great question. I tend, well, it depends on what I'm drawing, actually. If I were drawing something with fewer organic shapes than this, something with a lot more architecture, so like a city scene or a street scene, or maybe the interior of a building or something along those lines, I would usually do some kind of a rough perspective grid for myself where I would draw out some vanishing points and some lines to align everything to those vanishing points to help me with scale and with drawing things in proper perspective. Something like this, I tend to do it a little bit more by feel. But I am keeping in mind things like, okay, for example, the pitch of the roof. I've got it a little higher here than here because I know that I want this to be, I want my horizon line, to be about here. Okay, that's kind of where I'm envisioning it. And that's just something I'm keeping in the back of my mind while I'm drawing. So, you know, this roof will tilt like this. This bottom of the roof, right, this area here will tilt a little more. See, because eventually this is gonna, try and draw a straight line. Eventually this line and this line will converge. You know, if I did it properly, they would converge on that horizon line, which I guess is more like about here or something like that. And yeah, I've got that in mind. Once I draw one line at an angle, I'm kind of thinking about everything else having to line up with that. So this is the only kind of element in the illustration that really needs to make sure that we set that up correctly. But it does help then for me to understand scale. So, you know, I'm seeing this as being set down in elevation a little bit from where the kids are standing. Like they would have to walk down a little ways to then be on level ground to walk up to the house. The reason for that is because if they were on level ground now and the house were on the same level as the kids, what would happen is, because my horizon line is where it is, okay, I'll draw that in blue so it's clearer. Because the horizon line is here, okay, and if our kids were standing here and this was level ground, well, what would happen is I would have to then place the house, you know, more like up here or something, okay? And that would be not where I want it, right? So they would be standing here and they would walk straight up towards the house. And that's not what I want. So just by setting it down lower and then still following these perspective rules, hopefully we see that as being, oh, they are on elevated ground here. They're going to make their way down to level ground and then approach the house. So that is the reason this is set as low as it is relative to the overall vanishing point. The overall horizon line, my mistake. But yeah, in general, I would say for perspective drawing, it never hurts to give yourself a little setup. So for an illustration like this, you know, I could say, okay, horizon line is going to be maybe here. You know, there's my horizon line. And then I could decide my vanishing points are going to be here and here. And once I establish the size of a figure, okay, like Hansel and Gretel are about this big in the illustration, then certainly it helps for me to then position other figures depending on where I want to place new vanishing points and so on. So I could say, here's my figure, okay. So another figure would be this big as we're moving away, right? and so on. That helps if you want to do something like that. Yeah. We can talk about perspective at length if you like in another class. I think it's always helpful. I have to say, though, that I do a lot of eyeballing. The way I think most illustrators that I know tend to learn the rules of perspective, learn what looks right or wrong, and then kind of eyeball it from there. Unless they're working in comics and they just have to draw a lot of, scenes where a car is driving down a city street and there are various buildings and objects in that scene that absolutely have to be drawn just right in order for it to work out. But for something along the lines of what I'm doing here, this is really kind of me just saying, all right, well, the house should be, roughly this size, this scale, right? In order for it to appear that it's the right distance away from where my figures are. And that's just me kind of eyeballing it and saying this feels about right. I don't look at this illustration and think that the figures themselves are giants and the house is a miniature. If that were the case, I know that I'd have to change something. But hopefully the way that it's lit with the lighter areas here, the darker areas here, the space that I'm creating, hopefully, between these two planes is going to work out. And the perspective should be decent enough for it to work out. Now, getting back to overlap and silhouette. I just mentioned this idea of the house being on one plane and the figures being on another. So I want to illustrate this for you so you can get an idea of sort of the concept. All right, so I want you to imagine that you have basically your illustration broken out into these planes like this, where your extreme foreground elements are going to be sitting here. So we've got Hansel and Gretel here and the tree. So like this is one plane. And these objects project forward. And there's that branch, right? And they overlap what's on here. And that's for us going to be there's a lot of space between this plane and this plane in this illustration. We're trying to create that illusion of space. So we add a few value changes, right? Darker, lighter, darker, lighter. We can alternate a little bit, but generally speaking, we're moving towards slightly lighter as we get to the house. And then we want to place that house there. So that house is going to be sitting about here. Okay, little chimney there. And that's really kind of the only object we have in that space. We want to really highlight that and make it look good. And then behind that, we're going to have some foliage of various sorts. Okay, so that's that kind of like middle ground foliage. Okay. Whoops, I just drew off that plane there, sorry. And then beyond that, we want to get into what lies in I'm going to knock that one way back, actually. So now we're going way, way, way back. And now we're going all the way into that extreme background area where we're going to have, some more trees and a hill or whatever back there. And I want you to sort of think of your illustration this way, where you have planes. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is foreground, and this is background. If you've ever worked in the theater or seen how they do stage design, set design for the stage, pardon me, you'll see that they think in these terms. They think about, okay, you know, we're going to have in the foreground, there's going to be this tree and a little rock, okay, and then, you know, you go about 5 feet back from there, we'll have another little set piece here with a bush there, and our figures can walk in between these 2 set pieces. They can hide behind the bush here. Maybe the robber in the play is hiding here, ready to jump out and steal something. And then back here, we're going to have some kind of a set piece that allows for people to come and go. So we'll have an arch that's a doorway of some kind and a window for people to look through, right? So we got more space now between here and here. You can have characters come and go from in here. And then finally, in the background behind all that, that's where you have your forest or whatever background elements you have. So it's like set design for the stage. So we get all this depth and all these options for people to move in and around these spaces all the way up to the front of the stage here, okay? Now with your illustration, if you use this kind of mindset, you can think about overlaps in the same kind of way, and that's how you can get to this kind of arrangement of shapes where you think the same kind of in the same kind of language, or I'm thinking about all of this stuff in the foreground here is its own thing. Okay, this is all, this whole set of shapes here is one. You know, you could even include, I suppose, the tree if you want to get that simple about it. Although eventually I'm going to add a little separation there. But this is one, right? We move slightly back, and this is really almost part of that too because he's leaning on it. But the idea is I want this to appear that it's slightly back from where we are here. So now we got a little more distance, okay? Then we use this area here to push us back a little more, so we'll detail that with some grass or something, some grasses and maybe some little foliage and bits like that. We haven't even gotten to those details yet. And then I want to have this expanse, this open space here. And that space helps us to breathe and also to move even farther back. So we're not getting everything so tight between the tree and the house. And I would definitely soften the value here, lighten the value here a little bit as I get close to that tree to just push it back a little more. So you could see what that would look like if I just grabbed that same brush I was using. Mega Pack, Paint Box, Cool Drag. Here it is. If I had this color, hide this for a moment. You know, I could come in here, make this just a little lighter as I get close to that branch, right? Just to soften all that up. And just by lightening that, adding more contrast, what we have happening, then popping this tree, brightening that highlight. Okay, by adding that contrast, we separate the house from the tree even more, right? We really want to push that back in space. So I'm just going to lighten everything there. Get that a little lighter. Add a bit of a real pop right there if you really want to go nuts, okay? You get the idea. But by separating out those two, you can really push that back. There we go. And we would soften the edges here too. Like the painting wouldn't be so sharp edged back here. Try to soften, make that a little fuzzier. That makes sense. Anyway, right, so then this is another plane here for the house. And that's its own shape on its own plane, followed by those bits of foliage. And then now here we're going way into the background. And you can see that's a very light value, very close to the sky value, right? We're not separating those two out too much. There's not too much contrast there. So our eye is not drawn there right away. The high contrast is where we go. So the heads against the sky here, and those background elements, and so on. So with overlap, you really can create the illusion of depth, and that's what we're trying to do, right? So get rid of these little guys here. There we go. I was drawing on the wrong layer. I'm sure you guys have done that before. We all do it. But yeah, that's what's creating that illusion of depth. And in simple terms, it's that old game of what we talked about in the second exercise, where we had the wine bottle shape and the circle and the line. And then the challenge was, I don't know if any of you did this exercise, but if you hadn't, I hope you gave it a try. If you did, good job. How many ways can you arrange these three elements in a rectangle, in a square, whatever you want? How many different ways can you arrange them and come up with interesting compositions? And of course, one of the keys to making that work is to take one object and overlap, right, with another object and change the scale of these. So for example, we could do this. We could take that circle and throw it back here like that. All right, so now this is overlapping this, and I could have the line do that. Overlapping these makes this come forward, and then this goes back, right? Or even just if these are sitting in front of you. And I put the circle there. All right, you're gonna read that this is in the foreground, this is behind it, right? And then of course, throwing that line back there, all of a sudden gives us the impression of there being the edge of a table, or somewhere where we have a horizontal surface that meets a vertical surface, right? We don't know. But that illusion is essential to creating depth in 2D illustration, right? With paintings and drawings, we are trying to create this 3D space, and overlap is key to that. So we have a lot of overlap going on here to look at. Not only do we have our figures overlapping pretty much, and this tree overlapping pretty much everything that's happening in the middle ground and the background, but if it weren't for these overlapping elements, the illustration would lose so much of its depth. It would be such a terrible thing to have these figures here and to then leave this entire big fat space here. Let's see, just be, you know, a value like that. Look at the difference. This is a flat illustration, okay? But by adding these elements that overlap, starting with the house, overlapping that foliage here, overlapping then the background, and then the sky behind that, you're creating all this depth and space for the viewer to move from extreme foreground all the way into the extreme background and everywhere in between, rather than having them jump from this area in the front that has some interesting shapes to nothing, just a plain plane, if you will. And that's not what we want. All right, so that's a lot to talk about there, a lot to think about. We haven't gotten into refining any of this stuff. We haven't looked at the interior of these silhouettes now, because the next step for me would be to start to work out a few details in the interiors of the silhouettes and start to shape those a little better, refine those a little better, sculpt those a little more. You know, there's some areas where, for example, the silhouette of Gretel, I would now, if I wanted to, you know, start getting a little bit more picky about how I'm drawing that. And I would probably stick with a brush that had a bit more control. This is the creamy brush. You know, but I would start to carve away and work out some of the details of the face there with a little bit more precision. See that? Starting to figure out her head shape a little more clearly. would make that a little smaller so I could start getting into nitty-gritty territory here. So this is where you need to take your time, because when this stage is done, I start to look at some color ideas. Right, so that looks like a much better head now than what was there. I want to get that shoulder a little higher than the other shoulder and show that twist of the back there. Now I would start to really work out what is the exact shape here for the hair. Do we have some little ribbons coming down? I kind of like that idea. That could be kind of nice. Starting to think about things like that. And then eventually what I'll do is I'll start coming in inside the silhouette, come into that area and start exploring how to make those shapes read a little more clearly with some other values. So I don't want to go too much lighter than this. Just come up with something like that. See that? That's a little bit too dark. Come up with something like, there you go. I can read that. So I could do things like pop a little, the rim of the ear there. I can just see that shape. I don't know if that's too light for you all to see, but hopefully not. Just to kind of place that helps me understand what I'm doing there. I could start looking at ways to add some quote-unquote rim light to some of these areas here. And that will be helpful for us to read what's going on, right? See? And do the same thing here. So we've got enough light peeking around the corner there to bring that to light, that area there. No pun intended. Just to make that read. There. So that's the kind of thing I do. Start sculpting a bit more inside these silhouettes, right? So that it's starting to be clear what I'm looking at. I don't want to go too far with that, but you know, that's the kind of thing where, and then I would notice, oh, you know what? Definitely need to scale that up. So this is the beauty of Photoshop. I can play with scale. And so on, and so on, and so on, and you get the idea, right? So that is what comes next for me to get this to start really working out the way I want it to. All right, now let's pause for a moment and see if anybody has any questions. Any questions about how I'm using overlapping, how I'm using silhouettes? Those are the two main things I want to chat about today in looking at this illustration. Let's see how we're doing. Different planes is actually how they used to film vintage animation. Yes, Cody Bear. I was lucky enough to go to the Disney Studios with Cleo Chang last year. She was kind enough to show me around, and I got to meet some ridiculously talented folks. But we did get to go to that building where they have that original camera where they would put the planes, the glass, and photograph the animation. That was really something to see. Pretty neat. Let's see here. The way you're breaking this down is digestible and informative. Well, great, Randy. I'm glad to hear that. I hope this is helpful. Anne-Marie says, this session is giving me some ideas for another project. Excellent, excellent. Okay. You love the ribbons, Cody. Okay, cool. Thank you. I love seeing compositions in their tonal stage. Yeah, you know, there is something about looking at drawings or paintings in grayscale, you know, or before they get to color. But the thing is, if you can get it to work in just a few values, so if I were to break this down, I would say there are maybe at most 6 values at work here, probably more like 5 to be honest. And that's a good, you know, if you're in that 5 to 6 range, you're in good shape, folks. I think you're really doing well. If you can make it work and make it read and still get that enough of a feeling of depth, good job, you know? Once you start getting into a really wide range, sometimes things get a little muddy, sometimes it's less clear. Best to kind of stick with something along that 5 to 6 kind of range, I think. And I think that'll serve you well. So, says me, I don't know everything, but that's definitely my opinion. If you wanted it, there it is. I just gave it to you. Lightening this up a little bit here. Okay, so yeah, now you know this is. I would play and play and play and really just try and get this to read. And start going inside, like I said, a lot of these shapes now to make them work. Get them a little tighter. And the next step, though, would be color. And boy, I tell you, color is a tough one for me because I have the hardest time making up my mind. I also have a tough time just seeing color really well. A lot of people just have a much better eye than I do, and I have no problem admitting that I struggle a lot with color. However, the good news is, if you're like me and you struggle, there are formulas you can use to help yourself along. One, just show you this really quickly, is to just throw a color on top of everything and start building up with colors that are similar to that color, analogous colors, your illustration, and then you start adding complementary colors from there. So let's just do that. We'll just grab this. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer here in Photoshop, and I'm going to set that mode of that layer to color. Okay? Excellent. All right, now let's say we're going to have this be like late in the day kind of situation. So we're going to go kind of this area for the sky. Kind of go like that. So it's getting later. Actually, I want to kind of hit it like this. There we go. Remember, there, got to hit it with something that's, so we're moving a little bit towards late in the day. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it a little cooler and do this, and then I'm going to come up to the warms here, and I'm just going to do a little gradient from the top down like this. All right, so that would be like how I'd start and say, okay, now I want to react to what I'm seeing here. And okay, so just try stuff, see how it looks, you know? So make the trees kind of have this kind of color. Now we're actually starting to feel like now as we're getting into like early evening, because if things are starting to cool down this much with the shadows and everything, that's probably what we're looking at. So I could start with something like this. And just kind of get a feel for how that looks. Go a little greener, a little darker there, and then start putting in some shapes for the foliage there. When you set it to color mode like this, your values remain exactly as they were. You're just colorizing them, basically. It's like colorizing a photo, a black and white photo. You know what I mean? Throw a little sort of a reddish kind of color on that house. Pinkish kind of reddish color. And pop for that roof, make it a little bit more like a orangey kind of color. Now maybe that's like, I can say, oh, that's the sun that's going down. Maybe I want to do that. So maybe my highlights, I start to like pop in that sort of orangey kind of color. See how that looks. Right? So much you can do. Anyway, we'll pick this up again soon, everybody, next week. Talk some more. Hope you all are going to have a great weekend. Everybody stay safe, and above all, be kind to one another, please. And I hope you have a great time. Ciao for now.